but I'll. All right, so now I will make you the host.
I am duly honored.
You are now the host, so you can let the people in. There's like 4 or 5 people waiting.
Yeah, I see.
Fantastic.
I've met all joining.
All right, you're good to go.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello. Can everyone hear me?
I can. Don't know about everybody else.
Okay. Just give me a wave if you can hear me. Okay, good. Right. It's good to be able to see at least a couple of faces here. Suzanne, I love your smile, but it's not you, okay? It's just not you. And Sharon and Larry, that's definitely not you.
Well,
Okay.
Larry is driving, so I don't think you would see me.
Okay, you get a pass.
Thank you.
Okay. Did anybody have any questions you wanted to ask from last time or anything about what you might have read? All right, hearing no questions. We're going to start right in where we left off. All right. We talked about, Moses coming down from Sinai, and you would think that after all the Israelites had been through, they would be on their best behavior at this point. And it doesn't turn out like that at all. Right? Moses is away for 40 days, presumably getting other commandments, and the people either they panic or they get bored or they just want a good old-fashioned orgy, like a lot of pagans did with their gods. And they go to Aaron. And what do they suggest? Let's build an idol and worship it. And Aaron has to know that this is not a good idea. It's not going to go well with God. It's not going to go well with Moses. So he tries to stall them. And he says, bring me your jewelry. Maybe he thinks that will stop them. Who wants to give up their expensive jewels that they got when they left Egypt, right? And instead they bring it all, right? And they mold it into the shape of a calf, and poof, this is your God, O Israel. So, I guess it's much easier to deal with this visible God than the one who gave them the 10 commandments and who they know is giving them a lot of other rules. And so what happens? As we all could have predicted, God is angry. Even Moses gets angry when he comes down. He smashes the 2 tablets made by God himself, right? And he burns up the calf and grinds it into powder and mixes it into some water and makes them drink it. I guess the idea was that they would get a distaste for this kind of idol worship. Oh, and by the way, one tribe, the goody-goodies, the tribe of Levi, didn't participate in this golden calf business. So Moses tells them what to do, and they kill 3,000 of the sinners. Not a particularly tolerant response, but they were not into pluralism at that point. Okay? They do not kill Aaron, who is also part of the tribe of Levi, even though he sort of enabled the Israelites. And when Moses confronts him, Aaron says, I threw the jewels into the fire and out came this calf. Right? It's an excuse on the level of the dog ate my homework. Right? he's kind of hapless in this situation, Aaron. Now, ironically, Aaron will wind up being the first high priest, the first Kohen Gadol, maybe because he was spokesman for Moses to the Pharaoh. And as the tradition develops, Aaron becomes what is referred to as the Ohev Shalom, the person who loves peace and who makes peace between people. And if that's true, maybe he was very beloved by the people. Telushkin also talks about their sister Miriam. Remember the sister who put the baby in the Nile? And she also leads the women singing and dancing after the crossing of the sea. And so she has a special status from then on as well. So one of the lessons of the episode of the Golden Calf, which Telushkin touches on, is that faith shouldn't and actually doesn't depend on miracles. Now, the Israelites already had miracles. And as soon as there is a crisis, like, needing water, or like Moses being out of sight, they forget whatever rules they had. And eventually, as we will see, God decides that this generation is so hapless that the entry into the promised land will have to wait until the next generation. A slave generation doesn't become believers in God and freedom so easily. Right? Comments or questions here before we go on? Okay. Oh, yeah. Suzanne, you have to unmute. You have to unmute, Suzanne.
You can call me whatever you want. I answer to a lot of things. The 3,000 people that were killed, since we all know numbers have great symbolism, was there a symbolism for that? Or does it ever say how they were chosen? Were they just the first bunch of people that walked by?
Or perhaps they were the ones who were most directly involved, bringing their jewelry and, dancing around the calf or whatever they did with it. I don't know if there's a specific symbolism to the number 3,000. Wouldn't surprise me at all, but I'm not aware. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Anything else? Okay. So let me just see here if I have what I don't have what I'm supposed to have out here. Hold on one moment. Let me. Here it is. Okay. So this is the first thing that happens to the Israelites after Sinai, right? They go from Sinai, the heights of the spiritual, to committing the biggest sin in Jewish history, right? The making of a golden calf, right? So one form of ancient worship was sanctified and became accepted as part of Jewish practice, and that was animal sacrifice. Animal sacrifice ultimately was limited to one place, which became the temple in Jerusalem. When the second temple was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, that was the end of such sacrifice. Many philosophers and biblical scholars believe that the reason why it was permitted in the first place was because the people were not yet ready for a more spiritual form of a relationship with God. They didn't have a prayer book as such. That developed much later and became more formalized after the temple was destroyed. There have not been sacrifices since the end of the Second Temple, almost 2,000 years ago. I will tell you that in my congregation in Kansas City, I once took a phone call from a non-Jewish person who said, "I'd like to come and visit your synagogue." I said, "Okay, well, that's fine. We have non-Jewish visitors all the time." And he said, "And I'd like to know when you have the sacrifices. I'd like to see you perform the sacrifices." And I had to explain to this guy that we hadn't been doing that for almost 20 centuries. Apparently, there are many non-Jews, particularly Christians, whose view of Judaism stops when the Bible stops. And that's all they know of Judaism. They don't know that the Judaism of today was largely developed long after the Bible was finished. Right? It's certainly based on the values and the experiences and the laws of the Bible. But some things have really changed a lot. Right? So today, we do acknowledge that the sacrifices were very meaningful for ancient Jews. Coming to the temple was intended to be the kind of experience which brought people much closer to God. The prophets emphasized that justice was much more important than sacrifice, and that there were many hypocrites who thought that their sacrifices could make everything okay with God, regardless of what injustices they had committed. But the prophets were not saying that sacrifices in and of themselves were wrong. Okay? Now, Aaron was the first one responsible for offering sacrifices on behalf of the people, and his family and his descendants continued to hold that role. And such descendants are called Kohanim, priests, plural for Kohen. Right? And he was the first Kohen Gadol, the high priest. Right? Once sacrifices became centralized in the temple, there were all sorts of sacrifices based on the commands that are mostly found in Leviticus. Right? Some of them were daily offerings. There was an offering every morning and every afternoon. Some were offerings that individuals brought as atonement for whatever sins they might have committed, right? Or maybe a really specific sin. Right? Some of them were peace offerings. Others were just gifts that they brought to God. And there were additional offerings given on Shabbat, on the major festivals, plus at the beginning of each new month in the Hebrew year. Not every sacrifice brought was an animal. Some of them were meal offerings. On the festival of Shavuot, people brought offerings from the first fruits of the harvest. But all of these sacrifices ended when the temple was destroyed. So naturally, the end of the temple was a very traumatic event for all the Jews. Even if their lives were not greatly affected by the war with Rome, which led to the end of the temple. And we'll talk later about how this led to the reorganization and reconstruction of Jewish life. But I'll give you just one example of that for now. As Telushkin mentions, instead of bringing the special sacrifice for Passover, the Paschal lamb, which everybody brought to the temple, the rabbis invented the Passover Seder, where the story of the Exodus is told and its meaning is expanded upon. Right? There was no Passover Seder in the Torah itself. There's they really didn't invent such a thing until after the temple was destroyed. Some of you may have heard the suggestion that the dinner of Jesus with his 12 disciples was a Passover Seder. The Passover Seder hadn't been invented yet. Might have been a holiday meal, might have been a Shabbat meal. I mean, we're not sure, but it was definitely not a Seder in the sense that, we understand that today. Okay? The traditional prayer book includes prayers for the restoration of the temple and the sacrificial system. Most modern Jews don't think that would be a great idea. It would, in fact, be a step backwards spiritually. Interestingly, our rabbi at Beth Yeshurun, Rabbi Strauss, is himself a Kohen. He's a very gentle person. I don't really think he'd want to be involved in the slaughter of lots of animals. In any case, I don't think that our leadership would want to turn our parking lot into a stockyards. Very unlikely that the temple would be rebuilt on its current space because the Muslims built their own mosque, the Dome of the Rock, on that site back in the early days of Islam. It was originally built about 692 of the Common Era, later collapsed and then was rebuilt in the 11th century. And it was built on top of the Temple Mount. Okay? So tearing down that mosque might put a little damper on whatever good relations Israel has with Arab nations.
You think?
There's a good thing going right now, with the Abraham Accords and, some momentum towards peace in that. And I don't think anybody in Israel, at least no one in the Israeli government, wants to make that happen anytime soon. There are some ultra-Orthodox Jews who hope for that, who would like to see the temple restored, but they are definitely a minority. Now, our conservative prayer book, while acknowledging how much the sacrificial system meant in its time, always refers to it in the past tense. We do not have prayers that the temple sacrifices be reestablished. Okay? And I would guarantee you that a lot of modern Orthodox Jews, while they may say the words in the Siddur that talk about the restoration of the, what they mean by that is not that we should tear down the Dome of the Rock and, start up with animal sacrifices again in the rebuilt temple. A little more about the book of Leviticus. Right? In addition to all of the laws about sacrifices, or at least, most of them, and certainly most of how that system was supposed to work, chapter 19 contains a very important batch of ethical laws, including what some might think of as the 11th commandment, which is love your neighbor as yourself. Very interesting fact. If you look in the text of the Torah around that verse, you can look above it, you can look below it, you can look to the right and the left. There are no exceptions listed. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's a commandment. Right? And as Telushka notes, very important fact, this presumes that you do love yourself, right? That you have some positive sense of self. Otherwise, why would it say to love your neighbor that way? Right? So can you actually do it? Can you actually love your neighbor as yourself? Can anyone really do it? And Telushkin quotes the teaching of the Hasidic leader, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, to the effect that just as we love ourselves, despite the flaws we know we have, so should we love our neighbors, despite the faults we see in them. And I think that's one of the great teachings about this particular mitzvah. We give ourselves, or at least I would say most of us give ourselves a lot more slack than we give other people. So, part of fulfilling this mitzvah is cutting other people as much slack as we give ourselves. Okay? Questions or comments up to here? Going once, going twice. Yes, Suzanne.
It sort of sounds like the first psychiatrist's event or meeting when you talk about love your neighbor. I mean, I'm not trying to be flip or something, but having to love yourself. I don't recall ever seeing that in the Bible, and it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, I do not know that concept is in the Bible. I think the Baal Shem Tov simply took it for granted that most normal people have some positive sense of self-esteem. And that's a good thing, right? If you had someone who was so depressed that they didn't think anything of themselves, you'd be worried about them, and rightly so. Okay. Other questions or issues? Okay. So we come to one other thing about this verse. It says, love your neighbor as yourself, but that's not the end of the verse. The end of the verse is, I am the Lord, right? Right? So it's as if to emphasize that this ethical command and Jewish ethics in general comes from God. We Jews sometimes act as if we invented Jewish ethics. What this says is God invented Jewish ethics, right? And this verse is a major principle. One of the great sages, Rabbi Akiba, said that this was the most important principle in the Torah. There is a slightly different version, as Telushkin mentions, which in a way is a little bit easier to manage. The teaching of Hillel says, what is hateful to you, do not do unto your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Mm-hmm. Now go and study. Okay? So that's what we're going to take as a minimum from Leviticus. There are a number of very important stories in the book of Numbers. Right? A lot of it talks just about a census of the Israelites, hence the name of the book in English, and also, their wanderings from place to place. Right? The name of the book in Hebrew is Bamidbar, which means in the desert. Right? They're wandering through the desert. Right? But there are some very important things that happen in the desert. Right? A number of stories that really should be known and their lessons known to every Jew. One of them is really a continuation of the story of the golden calf, about why the slave generation did not go into the promised land. Moses sends 12 spies into the land. He sends one leader from each of the 12 tribes. It's kind of a political move, right? A way to include everyone. And they go and they examine the land and they come back and they say, yes, it's a wonderful land, very prosperous, very fruitful. Telushkin does note the use of one phrase in their report, which has stuck in Jewish tradition, the description of the promised land as the land of milk and honey. Right? But 10 of the 12 spies say, these guys in the land are giants. If we made war on them, they would slaughter us. No way, we're not going. We don't want to go. The other two spies, Joshua and Caleb, say, don't worry. There's no reason to believe, don't exaggerate their strength. There's no reason to believe we can't handle them. And in any case, God is with us. So what's the problem? Let's go. Well, the problem is the Israelites still have this slave mentality, including a lack of confidence in the God who has gotten them this far. So they turn on Moses and they say, did you bring us into this desert to die here? And so at this point, God declares this is not working. This generation just cannot do it. They are not ready. And they will indeed die in the desert. Only the next generation will be tough enough and loyal enough to overtake the inhabitants of the promised land and reclaim it. Only Joshua and Caleb from this generation will be able to go forward. Now, when they hear this, the people have a change of heart and they send out a band of soldiers to go make war in Canaan, which doesn't succeed because God is not with them anymore. That is the end of the matter, right? The next key story is the rebellion of Korach. Korach is kind of like one of the nobles among Israelite families, not that they weren't all slaves, right? He was probably a head slave, so he thought he was a big shot. Maybe that contributed to his ambition. A very opportunistic person. He accuses Moses and Aaron of overstepping their authority. He says, all of the community are holy and God is in their midst. So why do you raise yourself above everyone else? Well, that's bogus because it was actually God who gave them authority, right? Moses and Aaron didn't seek or claim any authority for themselves, but nevertheless, 250 tribal chiefs stand together with Korach. That's a fairly serious challenge to Moses' authority. And so eventually Moses says, fine, let's meet again tomorrow and God will decide between us. And Moses says, if these people die a normal death, it was not God who sent me. So what happens? The earth opens up underneath this group of rebels, swallows them up, and they are gone. Interestingly, as Telushkin points out, Korach's family did not join with him in this rebellion. And the prophet Samuel, who we will read about soon, is descended from Korach. Right? We're not all that big on yichus, on dignified ancestry. Right? Samuel could be Samuel even though he was, a rebel against the greatest Jew in the Bible. The next key story is not included here by Telushkin. It relates to Moses himself. As they tend to do in the desert, the Israelites complain that they don't have enough water. God says to Moses, so you and Aaron, I want you to take that rod. Remember that rod you took to Egypt? Right? And all the miracles there. So assemble the community before a rock and tell the rock to give them water, and it will. Well, what happens is that Moses is pretty steamed up at the Israelites over all this, and he says, listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock? And he actually strikes the rock with the rod, and presto, water. Right? But God speaks to Moses here and says, you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity before the Israelites, so you will not lead them into the land. Okay? Now, it is often believed that what Moses did wrong was to hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock. as God had said. But the Torah doesn't say this. What specifically does God mean in saying, you didn't affirm my sanctity before the Israelites? Maybe it was hitting the rock, but many commentators suggest that it was the way in which Moses spoke in anger and impatiently to the Israelites. And yes, they're an unruly and ungrateful mob, but Moses is not responding to that appropriately. If he's the man of God, he has to speak to them on a higher level, right? Without showing anger. Right? Either way, the result is that Moses is not able to continue with them when they go into the land. And it's reasonable to assume that for the next phase, the Israelites maybe need a different kind of leader, maybe a wartime leader, a general. But in any case, whatever it is they need, it won't be him. Joshua will be the appointed leader, appointed by God for the next phase. Questions or comments before we go on here? All right. So the next story, number 4 in this list of stories in Numbers, is much more fanciful, but also extremely interesting. It begins with the following. The king of Moab, one of the nearby nations, is worried about this group of Israelites coming through the desert and ultimately headed his way. Well, back in the day, if you didn't have a big army of your own, what did you do about a group that you didn't want in your neighborhood? You hired someone to curse them. Right? If you had an army, so fine, you just sent your army against them. But otherwise, you hired someone to curse them. By the way, one of the laws in the Torah forbids doing that sort of thing, either yourself or getting someone to do it for you. Right? There happens to be someone available whose curses are reputed to be very effective, and his name is Balaam. And if you pay Balaam the right amount, he will curse the Jews. But God pays him a visit the night before, and he warns him, says, you can only say what I tell you to say. Balaam is duly warned. Balaam loves a good payday, right? But he knows his limits. So instead of producing curses, all he can offer is blessings. In fact, one of those blessings got put into the prayer book. Many traditional Jews say it whenever they walk into the synagogue. The verse, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael, how good are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. One of Balaam's other blessings also became famous. It is his description of the Israelites as Am Levadad Yishkon, a people that dwells apart. Now, what does that mean? Right? Jews, we may live among other nations, but we maintain our own way of life apart from other religious groups, apart from other cultures. So all this is happening, and Balaam is pouring out blessings on the Jews. He's also getting more and more put out because he's missing out on a big wad of cash. Right? And so next day he sets out on his donkey. He's going to try and see if God will let him do something that he can get paid for. The donkey sees an angel of God in the road with a sword in his hand. So the donkey naturally swerves to the side of the road to avoid running into the angel. Balaam has no idea because he can't see the angel. He starts pounding the donkey. The angel keeps moving in the path of the donkey, and Balaam gets more and more frustrated. The donkey kind of bangs him into a wall on the side of the road. He has no idea why the donkey is swerving around. And we are told that God opens the donkey's mouth, and it says to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you keep hitting me?" And Balaam says, "Look, a talking donkey." Now, that is not actually what's in the Torah. I mean, Balaam doesn't seem surprised at all because, I mean, after all, who hasn't seen a talking jackass, right? Well, that's one of the oldest Jewish jokes. I first heard it from a rabbi on the Shabbat when this episode was read from the Torah. To be Jewishly literate, you should also know some good Jewish jokes. Okay? And this one's right out of the Bible, see? The talking jackass. Anyway, Balaam tells the donkey, "You're mocking me. I'd kill you if I had a sword." And the donkey, who actually has quite a mouth, says, "Look, you've been riding me for ages. Have I ever done this to you before? Do I cause you problems?" And Balaam says, "Oh, well, no." And God now opens Balaam's eyes, and for the first time, he sees the angel. And the angel bawls him out for hitting the poor donkey, and Balaam feels pretty stupid, which is the point of the whole story, I think. It's an eloquent way of saying that Balaam is kind of stupid, that what he is doing is stupid, that this guy who people hire to give blessings and curses because they think he has some pull in the upper world, this guy actually sees less than his donkey. And that's the point of the story. Balaam tells the angel, "I'll turn back if you say so." The angel says, "Nah, keep going. You can only say what God wants you to say." And so more blessings pour out on the Jews, and the king of Moab is one frustrated fellow. So these are the big and interesting episodes in the book of Numbers. Plus, it describes the death of Miriam and the death of Aaron and how they were mourned by all the people. Comments or questions up to here? Okay, I can tell we're going to finish early tonight, which some of the Astros fans on this call may be very happy about, which is fine, right? Now we come to Deuteronomy, the last of the 5 books of Moses, which is a farewell speech from Moses to the Jewish people. Scholars believe that Deuteronomy is actually written a while after the other 4 books got put together. Was probably produced in the time of King Josiah, who was one of the last kings in the First Temple period, around 620 something before the Common Era. And Deuteronomy repeats some of the laws we have learned and adds a few details. So as a great example of this, and you can make this your assignment for those of you who want homework for this week, compare the 10 commandments in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and what they say about Shabbat. There are very few differences between the 2 sets of the 10 commandments, but Shabbat is the big area of difference. It will take you about 2 minutes to read and maybe 5 minutes to understand what is different and why it might be different. The book of Deuteronomy also contains one of the most basic prayers in Judaism, which we will discuss in more detail later on. Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. One God, one unifying force behind the universe. And very important, the verses immediately following, which begin with the word v'ahavta, you shall love God. Now that begs the question of just how you should love a God that we can't know in the way that we know other people. And this segment of the Torah offers some suggestions about how we should do that. More about that down the road. The Torah tells us that Moses died at the age of 120. I don't take that number as a fact, but it might suggest that there are three different eras in his life, each with their own birth and rebirth. The first part of his life is his youth in Egypt. The second part is his time in Midian. And the third part is where he either reinvents himself or God reinvents him as the leader of the Jewish people. What's really important about his death, aside from the fact that he dies outside the promised land, as God said it would happen, is that no one gets to know where he is buried. The tradition suggests that God himself buries Moses. Had there been a grave for Moses and people knowing where that grave was, it would have become a shrine, and perhaps he himself would have been worshipped. In fact, in modern Israel and elsewhere, we see that the graves of certain rabbis have become shrines, not necessarily for worship, sometimes even that, but unfortunately, a kind of commercializing of the lives of great people. If any of you have been to Tiberias in Israel, right, you might know that the tomb of Maimonides is in Tiberias. That is a mega shrine because Maimonides was certainly one of the great Jewish scholars of all time, and we'll talk about him too down the road. And as it happens, in that same little niche where Maimonides is buried, there are also a number of other graves of different sages from different eras. In fact, one of my ancestors, Isaiah Horwitz, who was a great mystic in the 16th and 17th century, died in 1630, and his gravesite is also there. Well, you know, when I went to the tomb of Maimonides for the first time, I thought, wow, this is going to be a really holy place. It's going to be very dignified. People will be standing around with, you know, praying and so on and so forth. It also, that is true, but it also turns out to be a place where they sell all kinds of trinkets. You know what the Yiddish word tchotchkes mean, right? It's a place where people buy and sell all sorts of cheap trinkets. It's really not befitting Maimonides, and I'm sure from what we know of Maimonides that he would not have approved of all that. And frequently, this is the way things evolve. When you make something into a shrine, somebody wants to make money out of the shrine. So it's not as dignified a place as you might think. Thank God that they didn't make that kind of shrine out of the grave of Moses. They couldn't because they didn't know where it was. Yes, Suzanne.
Could you repeat where the two versions of the Ten Commandments are found?
Yes. One is in Exodus chapter 20. The other is Deuteronomy chapter 5.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
Now, I have a question.
Please, Sharon.
I went on the first pilgrimage back in 1969, and we were able to go to Bethlehem and Jericho and Safed and the old city, the Muslim quarters. You know, back then it was safe. And I think it was in Bethlehem that we went in this weird little cave-like building and saw they had a lamp of eternal oil, and there was the grave of Abraham and Sarah.
You're thinking of Hebron.
Hebron. We went to Hebron.
Yeah.
Hebron was a Jewish town.
Yes.
Everything
Yes.
was Jewish.
That is the tomb of the patriarchs and most of the matriarchs. All right. Now, are they really buried there? Who knows?
No.
Right. But that's been kind of the assumption for many centuries, that that gravesite was kept up and that that's where the patriarchs and the matriarchs were buried.
But it's a big tour. It was a big tourist stop. I mean, that's kind of worshiping your ancestors in a idolic way.
Yeah, it's problematic. Okay, if I really believed that that was the place where our patriarchs and matriarchs were buried, I'd want to go see it too. Right? But I would want it to be a place that was more like a synagogue than a tourist trap. And it's a little of both. Hebron, by the way, now you would definitely not want to go there. In 69, in 69, it was much safer. It was just a different time.
We just tramped through the Muslim quarter of the old city like it was nothing.
Yeah.
It was a different time.
By the time I was there, I was studying in Israel 75, 76. After that, you didn't go in Arab quarters without an escort.
Yeah. Or without a cross on your neck.
Well, maybe that would do.
The Christian tourists can still do all that, but not us.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't do it. I want to come home.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or just to, get out.
Not have
Other
stones
questions or comments, reflections? Okay, so I'm going to leave you with that little assignment for next week, and tell me what you think about that when we get started. And we will go into the early prophets, the next part of the Tanakh. Y'all have a good evening, and I hope we'll all be at Game 7.
Well, they better change what's happening then.
Yeah, not good, huh?
Not good.
Oh, well, it changed last game. Maybe it'll change tonight.
Maybe
Have a good
so.
night, everybody.
Thank you very
night.
much.
Yeah, bye-bye.